disclosure source, which I haven't mentioned in a lot of team meetings, but we do have an NHD company here at Fidelity. It is called disclosure source. With NHD, we have, it's required by law in the contract. So you need to have it in your transaction close. There's two report options that we have. One is a $49 report, which is kind of the basic report that everyone offers. We have a more enhanced report that's $99, which includes environmental. And then we have the new and really talked about Fortressfire report as well. So part of today's training is going to be on some of the NHD products. Chuck is going to talk to you about what Chuck is our NHD guy here at Disclosure Source. You do order them through me, so make sure that if you're writing in the listing agreement, that you're selecting, on the buyer side, you're selecting Disclosure Source in the NHD column in the RPA. And of course, that's something that the seller traditionally pays for. Again, that's required by law. So just let me know if you have any questions on it. Chuck is going to go over pretty much in detail some of the things that we offer and how some of the important facts about the NHD report. And really, you guys, what this is about is to protect you guys and keep you out of lawsuits, right? Because we want to provide the most education to you guys so that you guys can stay out of trouble, and that you guys have the arsenal to educate your clients about some of this as well. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce you to Chuck Piro. He's our NHD expert. He works exclusively with Disclosure Source at Fidelity. So he is here. If you guys ever have a really detailed question about the report itself, I can always connect you to Chuck. He'll share his info. He has been doing NHD. He'll tell you, I don't know how long, longer than I've been alive, probably. So he knows a lot about NHD. So with that,
can you also bring NHD? We have some branding.
Well, yeah, Chuck is going to be doing that. Yeah, but it stands for natural hazard disclosure, and that is going to be again required by law in the contract. And Chuck is going to go into detail on it. So I'll leave that up to him, but I can always answer questions. Cool. All right, Chuck, it's all you. Hold on, Chuck. We can't hear you. Hold on.
Okay, yeah, you can hear me.
Oh yeah, we can hear you, but it's just on the computer side. Hold on a sec.
Okay.
Mine's plugged in. I'm not. Oh, let's think about.
Is it me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Hear you. It's just
Hold on.
in the room.
All right, try now.
Okay, here we go.
Yes, we got it.
All right, good deal. All right. Okay. Thanks, you guys. Thanks for letting me come into the office today, virtually anyway. Listen, we're going to go through a lot of information here, and I don't mind if you interrupt me to answer a question that you might have, rather than wait till the end. It's best to have these questions answered when they're fresh in your mind. So I'll just give you a little brief background about me. I've been in the real estate industry for close to 30 years. I've been in the NHD industry for 25 of those years, since 1998. So Duncan, I don't know when you were born, but I think it's probably before 1998. But nonetheless, I have traveled all over California, talking to agents about NHD. My purpose is to educate. Of course, I would like you to use my company, but my purpose really is to educate you in terms of the industry and the things I think that you need to know. So I'll just go ahead and we'll go ahead and get started here, and let's go. Okay, so we're going to talk about the new fire form that's out there called the FHDS. I'm going to try to simplify that for you. We're going to do NHD review, home hardening, defensible space, and we'll also talk about the Fortressfire report, which is a major thing that's coming out that you really need to know about. Okay, so first off, I just want to talk a little bit about due diligence, and of course, that's research that you do before you enter into a contract or a financial agreement with another party. It's essential when you're processing your own risk management policy. And it's crucial when you select a company in an industry that isn't regulated, and that's the NHD industry. It's not regulated. So this is what I think every agent needs to consider, either before selecting an NHD company, or even now if you already have somebody you're working with. But just keep this in mind. This is what's wrong with non-regulation. How easy is it to become a company that sells these reports that carry a lot of liability for both you and your client? Number one, there's no licenses or certifications given to these NHD companies. Nobody does background checks. Bonds aren't required. No one validates that all of these providers out there even have insurance. No one validates these providers' qualifications, and no one even confirms if the reports they sell to you are in compliance with California's Civil Code. Nobody oversees this industry, and that's not good for anybody in real estate that purchases these reports. So what's the role of an NHD company? It's to assist the seller and the seller's agent by providing required disclosure information in compliance with legal requirements. And it's also to provide a liability shield for both the seller and the seller's agent. And I want to make sure you understand, when I say seller and seller's agent, disclosure of natural hazards isn't just the liability of the seller. It's the liability of the agent as well. So if there's a lawsuit for non-disclosure or wrong disclosure, the lawsuit's going to go to the seller, the seller's agent, and the broker, etc. And you don't want to get caught up in that web, okay? But I'm going to tell you, you got to be careful, because providing a liability shield is not a guarantee in a non-regulated industry. And I'll get more into that later on. So we're kind of in a unique situation in that we never get to talk to the guy who actually pays the bill or buys the report, and that's the seller. So I just want to give a voice to the seller, okay? I should feel confident that my agent has carefully selected an NHD company that employs a qualified expert, produces my report in compliance with California law, and provides me with ample liability protection. Okay? I'm not asking my agent to get me the cheapest report. In fact, it's quite the contrary. I want an NHD report that satisfies my legal disclosure requirements, while at the same time protecting my liability in the event of an error that ultimately leads to litigation. You would feel the same way if you were the seller of property navigating in an industry they're unfamiliar with. They place a lot of trust in you, and in look at this industry is full of litigation, and so is this state. You don't want to get caught up in that stuff. All right, so let's just go a quick little review of what an NHD report is. Okay, there's 6 mandatory zones that are on the NHD statement. This is kind of like the backbone of an NHD company. So the first zone is a special flood hazard zone. That means if the property is designated in a type A or V FEMA flood zone, then the property is going to be designated in a flood zone, okay? Now, the reporting standards for flood zones is that flood zones are based on elevations, and that NHD companies report on the parcel, not on the structure, okay? So with that, let me just briefly touch on flood certs, because this has to do with flood zones, okay? Now, flood certs are typically prepared for lenders pursuant to them issuing loans. With Disclosure Source, we provide a flood cert as a courtesy when the subject property is located in a FEMA flood zone. You'll always get this document if the property you're selling is in a FEMA flood zone. So again, the NHD report is going to identify flood zones that will affect the parcel. The flood cert will verify if the structure on that parcel is also located in the flood zone. Okay, in other words, here's a flood cert. Let's take a look at a property. Let's say the property is like this. Okay, now the flood zone hits, as you can see the bottom of that graphic. Let's say the flood zone hits the bottom part of the parcel. The house is at an elevation that takes it out of the flood zone. It's higher than the flood zone. So when you get the flood cert, you want to look at this paragraph. And this paragraph is going to answer this question. Is the building or the mobile home in a special flood hazard area? And that's zones containing the letters A or V. What you want to find is this marked off as no. That's telling you no. The house on that parcel is not in the flood zone. It's at an elevation or position on the parcel that doesn't hit the flood zone. Okay, when that box is checked, flood insurance, I say, may be waived. Okay, when you look at that little paragraph there, it says, please note, the risk of flooding in this area is only reduced, not removed. But it also says, if no, flood insurance is not required by the Flood Disaster Protection Act. So this is a valuable document that you get from us for free when the property's in a flood zone. Okay, next disclosure is called an area of potential flooding. That just means the property's downstream from a reservoir that has a dam. And if the dam were to fail, like this graphic shows, where would the water go? If it affects the subject property, then you're going to be placed in an area of potential flooding. That's what the disclosure is going to say. To give you an example of how big that zone is, here's the San Fernando Valley. And up here at the top, there's a reservoir. And if that I think it's called the San Fernando Basin or something like that. If that, you can see that when you go up the 5, if you're heading up to La Valencia, you can see this body of water off the side of the freeway. If it were to break, look how large that area is. Everything in that blue area would be then in a dam inundation zone. Okay. The good news about this zone is that there's no added insurance. The lenders don't require insurance, flood insurance, when you are in a dam inundation zone. Next is a very high fire hazard severity zone. It's also known as a local responsibility area. These zones are based on vegetation density, slope severity, and a lot of factors that contribute to fire severity. Typically, fires that are in this zone are managed by the local fire department. The other fire zone is called a wildland area, which may contain substantial forest fire risks. It's also known as a state responsibility area. Funny that within these zones, it's not the state's responsibility to provide fire protection services to buildings or structures. And these are typically managed by CAL FIRE, not the local fire department. Now, sometimes CAL FIRE will enter into an agreement with an area to let the local people take care of it. And that's something that the buyer would have to find out when they purchase the property. Next is called a seismic hazard zone. Now, there's a lot of things underneath seismic hazard zones. That's going to include landslides, liquefaction, of course, tsunamis, coastal cliff instability, mudslides, debris flows, and avalanches. These are all examples of seismic hazard zones in California. What you'll see mostly on your natural hazard disclosure reports are going to be landslides and liquefaction. And these are the things that we can help explain to your concerned clients what this stuff means. Okay. And I don't want to get into this too deeply because we're short on time. But these are the things that I can help you with when your clients, they get freaked out when they see these things. Landslides. If you're anywhere near a landslide, blocks into a neighborhood that's in a landslide area, the report's going to say yes. Liquefaction. That's when there's a high water table, and in the event of an earthquake, the water can perk to the surface. And as you can see on that picture there in the middle where it says liquefaction, that house, although 1 story is underground, it isn't damaged. Well, you can't live there, but I'm saying it doesn't break apart like it does in a earthquake. Next, speaking of earthquakes, that's the next zone. It's an earthquake fault zone. And I think if you've lived in California for any amount of time, I don't know if we've felt one this strong, but we've all felt shakers, okay? But I want to show you what we look at when we look at an earthquake fault map. Here's a map. That red shaded area is going to be the earthquake fault zone. That's only about a quarter of a mile wide, or 1,320 feet. And as you can see on this graphic, it's really just a small little band. The length of that earthquake fault zone could go miles and miles long, but the width always stays the same, which is about 1,320 feet. So these are the phone calls that I would get from your clients, is that they're freaked out about being in an earthquake fault zone. But let's take a look at this. Let's look at this parcel right here at the end of the arrow. That parcel is completely in the earthquake fault zone. So your NHD report would say, yes, this property is in an earthquake fault zone. But let's look next door. That property is halfway in and halfway out. So of course, the NHD report is going to say, yes, this is in an earthquake fault zone as well. But then let's go next door to that property. That's completely out. Next door neighbor is in, but this guy is out. Do you think that he's safe in the event that that fault were to slip? Of course not. Nobody on this map is safe in the event that this fault were to slip. In fact, I would say that nobody listening to this meeting today is safe in the event of an earthquake, whether you're in the zone or out of a zone. It wouldn't matter how far out of the zone you are. If you think that earthquake damage is going to go right to that line and stop, that's just ridiculous. That's not the way things happen. In fact, the city most commonly noted for earthquakes in California is San Francisco. There are, listen to this carefully, zero, none. There are no earthquake fault zones in San Francisco County. None. What happens is the fault goes up San Mateo County and goes out into the ocean. And when it slips, damage happens to the city. But there's none of these little fault lines in the city of San Francisco, yet they suffer a lot of damage, okay? Here's a little trivia question. Earthquake faults are commonly considered active if there's been movement observed during the last how many years? So if you got an NHD report and it said you were in an active earthquake fault zone, what does that mean? Movement observed during the last how many years? Everybody should have a guess by now. Let's see what the right answer is. It's not 10 years, nor is it 1,500 years. Earthquakes are commonly considered active if there's been movement observed during the last 11,000 years. So active doesn't mean current. Active in terms of geology means activity within the last 11,000 years. Okay? So let's move on. Now looking at the report in this non-regulated industry, what are the most important pages of those NHD reports? And I've had a lot of answers, the signature page, the summary page. I would say it's the terms and conditions pages, because that's where the company's going to tell you what they're going to do if they make a mistake, okay? So you got to read the fine print. And why do you read the fine print? Because you get educated. Education is what you get when you read the fine print. Experience is what you get when you don't. And that's not the kind of experience that you want. You want to know what's going on before anything happens, okay? So like I said in the beginning, be careful. You purchase a third-party NHD report for liability protection for you and your client. That's why you get these things. But in an industry that's not regulated, there's absolutely no guarantee that your NHD providers offer you liability protection. Okay? So you got to read this stuff. Like, this is a company that we compete with. I'm not afraid to put them up here because this is education. Okay? But I'm going to go right to what I'm talking about. My NHD terms and conditions, and you read this little thing right here. And what's it say? The recipients in each of them expressly waive the benefits of California Civil Code 2778. First of all, I would say that most people don't read the report. Okay? Most people don't read this thing. If they do read it, they read the first couple of pages to find out if they're in or out of a zone. The people that read this report are going to be your attorney clients and maybe your engineer clients and those people that are used to this kind of stuff. But if you did read this report and I don't know if you would ever even look at this one little sentence that's buried in the terms and conditions. And if you did, you might go, that probably doesn't affect me. But let's look at this. Who are the recipients and what are you waiving here? Because it's pretty clear the recipients in each of them are waiving a benefit. And what benefit? The benefit of Civil Code 2778. So who are the recipients? The recipients aren't the buyers. The recipients, the seller and the seller's agent. They're the ones that ordered the report. So that phrase, the recipients, the seller and seller's agent, each of them expressly waive the benefit. Who would waive a benefit? You know, if we were looking for a job at a company that offered benefits, we would never say, oh, I'll just waive the benefits. I just want the job. Benefits are good things. But what are we waiving the benefit of 2778? What is that? Do you know what you're waiving? You're giving up the benefit of a paid defense by the NHD company. Who would waive the benefit of a paid defense when that is the reason why you're ordering the report in the first place? Is for liability protection. Now, my question would be, how can they get away with that? Okay, how do they get away with this? How is this legal? When you look at the California Civil Code, it says in the interpretation of a contract of indemnity, the following rules are to be applied. And they give you a whole bunch of things like what the third party has to do. They have to pay for a defense. There's all these things they have to do. Unless a contrary intention appears. And that, the recipient in each of them is a contrary intention. Okay? That's what you don't want. That's how these snakes in this industry get away from being hauled into court, because they don't tell you this stuff. Be careful, okay? Here's another consequence of non-regulation. Some NHD providers might deliver your report in a snap, yet they fail to disclose locally mapped hazard zones that are an essential layer of information. Failure to disclose locally identified hazards can easily turn into a non-disclosure lawsuit, okay? So let's take a look at these two properties. Both of these homes are obviously located in a landslide area. Now, you need to know that we gather publicly available information to come up with our disclosures, okay? Nothing that we do or any NHD company does is proprietary. Everything that we do is a matter of public record. So, where is the public record? Well, there's federal maps that we look at, and there are state maps that we look at, but there's also local maps. And some companies don't look at the local maps, and you'll find out that the state hasn't mapped all of our state, but the counties have. The counties have mapped their own counties, and that information is also publicly available, okay? So you look at these houses right here, both obviously located in a landslide zone, yet the landslide zones affecting these properties were only found on local level hazard maps. And if your company doesn't look at those maps, then you never know that these hazard zones exist, okay? So you take a look at this, okay? Now here's a report from our company, Duncan's company, disclosure source. Here's the disclosure. Down here it says, is in a supplemental seismic geologic hazard zone. And if you look at the map, you can see that little house icon is in the middle of, if you look at the legend, all of these brown stripes all over the place. That entire area is a landslide area because there's a lot of hills back there, okay? Then when you open up the report, you'll find the supplemental information. And what does it say? It says the property is in an area of high potential for landsliding. Well, look at the property, for God's sakes. I went and took that photograph. I walked on that property, and that landslide went right to that door that you see exposed right there, that little sliding door in the back on that little access room right there. Okay. Here's one of our competitors, Snap, on the same exact property. What did they say? There are 0 city county disclosures marked in. That's wrong. That is wrong. There is a report that says it. We found it. And what did they say? This is not located in a city county geohazard area. Okay, to me, this is a lawsuit waiting to happen. And that's what you don't want to get caught up in. Okay, so don't ever assume that all NHD companies are the same, because they're not. All right, now let's roll into AB 38 and the fire hazard and home hardening and defensible space stuff. Look, again, the role of an NHD provider to disclose if the property is located within various fire zones, including high and very high fire severity zones. So when you look at the NHD statement now, you're going to find the fire areas right here. One's called a high or very high fire hazard severity zone. The other one's called a wildland area that may contain substantial forest fire risks. Okay, if any of these things are marked off as yes, the example shows no, but what I'm telling you is, if any of these check marks are yes, then AB 38 is going to apply. And we'll get into that in a second. In the wildland area, AB 38 is going to apply if that area is in a high or very high fire zone. Wildland areas are typically in the suburbs, out in the country, okay? And their fire, the way that they describe those fire zones are either in low, moderate, high, or very high. If we're in a high or very high, then AB 38 is going to apply for those properties as well. Okay, so now you hear this term home hardening. What does it mean? Hardening a home against wildfires just means to take steps to improve the chance of your home and structures withstanding ignition by wildfires, firebrands, and flying embers. That's what home hardening is. Home hardening only applies to homes built before 2010. Make a note of that. Home hardening only applies to homes built before 2010. After 2010, they changed the building codes to tighten up all those little nooks and crannies that were open on older homes. So after 2010, you don't have to worry about home hardening. What is defensible space? It's a term for buffer zone that homeowners create between the structure, the house, and any flammable grass, trees, shrubs, or wildland area that surround it. Okay, so you can see on this diagram, zone 1 is 30 feet from the home. Zone 2 is the remaining 70 feet around the house. Okay, now this is good to note. If the subject property is located in a high or very high fire zone, the current owner is already required to comply with defensible space requirements. That's never been in question. This isn't anything new. If you live out in the country and you're in a high or very high fire zone, hey, you've had to comply with this law. It's called Public Resources Code 4291. And it says in short, a person who owns, leases, controls, or operates buildings that are in these zones shall at all times do all of the following: maintain defensible space of 100 feet on each side of the structure. Okay? Now, under the new law, AB 38, the seller must now provide certification that the property is in compliance with defensible space laws, and more likely, the buyer must agree that they will obtain certification within 1 year after the close of escrow. So basically what's going on with AB 38, to make this simple, hey, I've lived in this house for a number of years and I've had to comply with defensible space. That means I've had to trim my trees and bushes to keep it away from the house. Okay, I'm passing the baton to you now, the new buyer, that you now have to comply with defensible space. The good news is the law allows us to agree that you're going to do this within 1 year after the close of escrow. There is no sense of urgency through AB 38 to get this done. Okay, now let's look at the form that needs to be filled out. That's the FHDS. It's a two-part form. So the first thing on the first page that jumps out at you is going to be this questionnaire. Okay, fire hardening vulnerabilities. Now remember, this is filled out by the seller, by the owner of the property. If the house was built after 2010, they don't need to fill this out. But if it's built before 2010, then they have to fill this out. Okay, so let's look at these questions a little deeper. What are the questions that they're asking on that form? Are you, the seller, aware of any of the following features that may make your home vulnerable to wildfires and flying embers? So the first question is eaves, soffits, or roof ventilation where vents have openings in excess of 1/8 of an inch. Okay, well, look at, you probably all have seen houses that have all these holes in the vents. Okay, well, that's definitely a fire hazard. After 2010, they covered all that stuff up so sparks couldn't get in there. Okay, that's the difference. So the seller just answers the question. Do you have roof ventilation where they have vents and openings of 1/8 of an inch? The answer is either yes or no. Next question, roof coverings made of untreated wood, shingles, or shakes. Just go look and see what the roof's made of. It's either yes or no. Combustible landscaping or other materials within 5 foot of the home or under the footprint of any attached deck. Well, let me look at this. There's a wood stack underneath an attached deck. That's got to be moved 5 feet away from the property, 5 feet away from the house. Okay, that would be a yes. I've got wood there. I'm not saying I'm going to move the wood. I'm just telling you, yes, I've got wood under there. Okay, single pane or non-tempered glass windows, and loose or missing bird stoppings or roof flashing. And the last ones are rain gutters without metal or non-combustible gutter covers. So the seller either answers yes or no based on their actual knowledge. Good news is the seller's not required to fix or improve any of the items on that list. They don't have to go get double pane windows. There's nothing they have to do. They're just telling the potential buyer, these are the areas that make my home vulnerable to wildfires and flying embers. I'm sure that if the fire department was out there giving them an inspection, they would have told them to move that wood stack. They would have given them recommendations. Okay, so let's go back to the form. Again, the most confusing part of this form is going to be down here on section 3. And these are the phone calls I get all the time. How do I fill this out? Because there's a lot of options here. So let's look at what we're doing here. 3A, it's asking, the property is or is not subject to local vegetation management ordinance requiring defensible space around an improvement on the property. The seller should always answer is on this. I don't know of any county in California that doesn't have a local ordinance that just says, hey, you have to practice vegetation management, like that penal code I just showed you, 4291. At all times must manage defensible space. Okay, so the right answer to that is always going to be is. Yes, is. Next, B2. Okay, 3B1. What's it say? Seller is unaware of whether the property is in compliance. That's the default. Number 2 and number 3 don't have to worry about that. Okay, because people don't know if they're in compliance. So B1 is the most likely answer to that question, which means you don't check 2 or 3. All right? Let's get clear on that. There's 3 options. 1, 2, or 3. 1, the default is most often used in practice. Now let's go down to C. What does it say? Now there's a lot of options here. There's 6 of them, in fact. Okay? But the default is C1, no local ordinance. This option states there's no local ordinance requiring an owner to obtain documentation of compliance with state defensible space law or a local vegetation management ordinance, and that the buyer and seller agree that the buyer will comply with defensible space requirements within 1 year after the close of escrow. The reason this is the most common option in practice is that the other options typically don't arise. Other options are dependent on the existence of a local ordinance that requires an owner to obtain documentation of compliance before the property can be sold. That's called a point of sale requirement, okay? There are very few localities that have such strict ordinances, okay? There is no point of sale requirement in Southern California for a seller to have documentation of compliance before the property can be sold. So the best thing to do here is, again, don't check 2 through 6. Don't check anything. Just stick with no local ordinance. This comes straight from CAR, not from Chuck Piro, but from CAR and Guff Hutchinson. The only places that have point of sale requirements are Truckee and Paradise, which isn't anywhere near Southern California. Okay. And we talked a little bit about local fire zones. I do want to make something clear. Look at this report. This is information from state and federal maps. It shows that the property is not located in a very high fire zone. But come to find out, when we looked at the local maps, the property was identified as being in a locally identified fire zone. What do we do here? While localities may create their own maps, which may include fire hazard zones that are broader than CAL FIRE's, it is nonetheless CAL FIRE maps only that identify which properties are subject to AB 38. In other words, AB 38 does not apply to locally identified fire zones. That's just a little note there. So what's your seller want to hear? They want to hear, hey, I've done my due diligence and I selected your NHD provider from a Fortune 500 company. It's a company with the best protection for you, okay? And I'll tell you right now, I've been in this industry for a very long time. By a large majority, most providers in this industry are unqualified entrepreneurs who purchase data from data providers, and they exclude liability protection with fine print disclaimers. That's not who we are. We're a Fortune 500 company. I'll just put it that way. I'll get to that in a second. Okay. So let's roll into Fortressfire. This is a new thing. And to me, you need to know stuff about this before you allow this into your transaction. And I'll show you for obvious reasons. The first thing on a Fortressfire report that you need to look at, and this is like the first page of the report. The first page is that cover sheet I just showed you, had an aerial photograph of the subject property. The next page, warranty and disclaimer. So what do they say right out of the gate? Right here they say, Fortressfire makes no warranty as to the accuracy of any information contained in such report. They go on to say, be advised that all assessments in the wildfire risk reports are confined to areas visible with satellite imagery. There's no guarantee that the satellite imagery will be current or accurately reflect all of the structures or vegetation on the property that may exist or are blocked from satellite view on the day of the assessment. Fortressfire cannot be responsible for risks arising from structures or vegetation that are not visible from the satellite imagery, including without limitation any changes that occur after the date on which the satellite imagery was taken. Let me put this simply. They take a picture of the subject property from a satellite on a date. Okay? Now, I don't know when that date is, but then let's say the seller of the property, the owner of the property, one day decides, you know, honey, we need to clean up the property because it's all overgrown. So they hire a company to go out there and they get in compliance with what they're supposed to do with defensible space. Now their home's all buttoned up the way it's supposed to be. Okay. Then a month later, they put the house up for sale and somebody orders a Fortress report. And the Fortress report comes back and it's based on a satellite image that was taken before the guy even cleaned up the property. Like we've had situations where the owners of the property are holding a certificate of compliance from CAL FIRE saying that their property is in compliance with defensible space. Then they get this report from Fortress that says otherwise. All right. I'll get to the otherwise in a second. Now, what about the limitation of liability? Fortressfire should not be liable to you for indirect, incidental, remote, they go on and on and on, or loss of revenues or profits. In no event shall Fortressfire's aggregate liability exceed the amount paid to Fortress for the disclosure report. You know how much that is? It's $140. That's your liability protection on this report, $140. Now, when you look into the report, it's very nice. It has a lot of information. It's colorful, it's interesting, but let's dig a little bit deeper. Here's the next page of the report. And what do we have here? We have a CAL FIRE rating of very high, subject to AB 38, yes. This is the same information you would get with a natural hazard disclosure report from Disclosure Source, okay? AB 38 compliance, they're telling you it's not compliant. In order to be compliant with AB 38, this property would require, and they're telling you you're gonna have to trim about 40 trees here, okay? And then these compliant mitigations are estimated to start between $1,700 and $5,600. Okay, let that sink in for a second. This report is telling you, based on a satellite image, that you have compliant mitigation issues that could cost $5,600 to fix. Okay, to reduce this home's vulnerability, the property would require, and they're telling you what you need to do. Okay, now, vulnerability reduction there between $1,200 and $4,200. Now let's dig into the report a little bit more. Here's a link. This is a good link. This link is to schedule an inspection from CAL FIRE. I mean, that you would get that on our report. If you ordered a report from us, you're going to find that link. And you're going to click that link and you can schedule CAL FIRE to come out to the subject property and get an inspection done. Okay, that's nothing, that's no big deal. Then they're going to give you this nice photograph. Then they're going to isolate the parcel and they're going to number every single one of the trees on there. Then they're going to tell you more rating stuff. Okay, so the CAL FIRE rating, again, this is redundant. CAL FIRE rating is required. They're telling you it's very high. That you find that on an NHD report. This rating right here, USDA rating, beyond civil code requirements. That's over disclosure. This CPUC rating of extreme, I don't like the word extreme, number one. I don't like that at all. And I don't think you as a seller's agent would want that on there either. That is beyond what is required by the civil code, okay? That's unnecessary over disclosure. That raises red flags, which you don't want to do. Okay, next, they're going to start giving you all the details about how to fix up this property. Okay, I found this pretty interesting. This page of the report, this part of it are all the same questions that we just went over on the FHDS. You don't need this thing done twice. That company can't fill that out. The seller of the property fills it out. Okay, but now you look at this. You've got this threat vector breakdown, and they just come up with all this stuff on treatment of this stuff. But this is a more important thing. Here's the remainder of this report. Convective heat failure analysis. Next page talks about radiant heat failure analysis. Next page, ember entry surplus analysis. Next page, ember accumulation analysis. Next page, critical structure to structure failure analysis. Okay? Can anybody in this meeting tell me what this means? I mean, look, I've been in this industry 25 years. I couldn't tell you anything about any of these labels here. You know, ask your seller. What's he going to say? They don't know what the hell they're talking about either. I've always been taught since day one of selling, keep it simple, stupid. And this report is way beyond simple. It gets way too deep. Okay? So, last page of the report and what you need to know. My mitigation and protection plan estimate. So AB 38 compliance, what do they tell you here? Between $4,400 and $15,000. Vulnerability mitigation service, between $2,800 and $9,800. And wildfire protection plan, about $1,200. You're introducing an estimate to get this house in compliance with defensible space between $8,400 and $26,000. Okay? What might your seller say if you introduce this while they're in escrow and a buyer takes a look at this report? What's going to happen? What's your seller going to say? It's like, you know, what? What the hell did you do here? Okay? So I'm going to just wrap this up by saying education is key when new products are introduced into this industry. Okay? Car form FHDS is mandatory when the subject property is in a qualifying fire zone. Okay? The California Association of Realtors highly recommends the Fortressfire report. Do you know why? Because CAR is invested in this report. They've partnered with Fortressfire. They make money every time a Fortressfire report is purchased. CAR makes money. They don't make money on our reports, but they make money on this report. Next, the only way to obtain a Fortressfire report is through a handful of NHD companies, not our company. Our company, we're a Fortune 500 company. Our attorneys looked at that report and said, whoa, way too much liability here. We're not going to be players in this game. And you, as an independent person, you can't order this report by yourself. The only way you can get this report is through 4 different NHD companies. Okay? And there's dozens of NHD companies out there that chose not to participate. Wildfire disclosure report can only be ordered for single-family homes, not for vacant land, condos, or anything else. Next, the report includes monetary estimates for compliance with defensible space. These estimates can be in the, we've seen them at $50,000. Okay? Through the FHDS, which is mandatory when the subject property is in a qualifying fire zone, the buyer and seller agree that the buyer will comply with defensible space and that they'll do that within 1 year after the close of escrow. No sense of urgency here. Okay? Fortress gives you a sense of urgency. So I'm going to just wrap this up by saying be wise and be smart before you introduce a non-required report into your transaction. Because once that report is in there, if that deal falls apart, that report needs to be introduced to the new buyer. And now the seller is on a treadmill trying to figure out what to do here. Okay? So again, disclosure source, I'll just wrap it up. wholly owned subsidiary of Fidelity National Financial, which is a Fortune 500 company. Come on, people. Where do you think your seller would rather have you put their investment in their liability? Not going to be on an entrepreneur that's not qualified. We're a Fortune 500 company, okay? Publicly traded. That's where you need to be. You don't pay for the report, the seller does, but your liability is on the line. So the Fortress thing is just a heads up. We may at one time become a distributor, but if the report stays the same, my opinion would not change. You got to be really careful about what you get with that report. Okay. So with that, I'll be happy to take any questions. I don't see anybody in that room, but I don't have a bird's eye view. So.
Do you guys have any questions?
If you're asking a question, I can't hear you.
The other question is,
Can you hear us?
I can't hear you guys. Somebody needs to go next to the mic up there and kind of relay it to me.
Or I can relate.
okay, the question is, we supposed to look into that, or is that the transaction coordinator finds those type of disclosures?
For the NHD reports?
Yeah.
So the NHD reports are generally, I can answer this one, Chuck. The NHD reports are generally so when you are writing an offer as a buyer,
Yeah.
there's a space for NHD on the RP. Well, a lot of buyers or agents are putting seller's choice. So because the sellers are paying for it, they're allowing the listing agent and the sellers. So with this case, if you were going to want a big disclosure source to have the information provided to your buyer from the seller, you would write a disclosure source within the RP. And then it's still the $49 and $99 options, right, Chuck?
It's either a $99 option or a $75 option.
75.
Okay. But the difference between the two is the $99 NHD report from Disclosure Source includes environmental information, what's going on around the subject property. That's not mandatory for the seller to disclose environmental targets around a subject property. That would be an option, but it does identify leaking underground storage tanks and that kind of thing. But it's not mandatory. A lot of our clients order the $99 report just to put it all on the table. Okay. But listen, I do want to say something. I want to say that look, I welcome an opportunity to talk to you guys about this stuff. I look at this as like an audition to be a part of your team, because I think that every real estate agent needs to have qualified experts in their respective fields to help you through your transactions. And whether that be a title rep or an inspector or your escrow person or your home warranty person, I think that you need to have a natural hazard disclosure expert to help you as well. People buy property in the state from out of state, believe it or not, that have concerns when they're in these zones that we live in and day out. And they get concerned, and would be my job to take that fear away from them that for example, people that buy in like an earthquake fault zone that get freaked out. The obvious answer to that is, to me, in a typical real estate transaction, the buyer puts up 20% and the bank puts up 80%. Who has more skin in the game? The bank. If the bank was concerned that the property was in an earthquake fault zone, they would force the buyer to purchase earthquake insurance. They don't do that. Okay. And if you own a house, you'll know that every year your mortgage holder is going to send you a letter asking you if you want to opt in to purchase earthquake hazard insurance. Okay. And you either do or you don't. Okay. The only time the lender is required for insurance is going to be if you're in a flood zone. But none of these other zones trigger the need for insurance. Okay, so if it's not important to the bank, who's got more skin in the game than the buyer should probably understand that a little bit better. Okay, so there's always ways to talk to your clients, and you could always get a hold of me through Duncan. So that's what I would say. You know, get some good help on your side with somebody you trust.
John, with the fire, with things changing with fire insurance and insurance companies, has anything changed with insurance companies requiring something more for fire insurance, or is it stayed the same that you've seen?
What if you're? I think I heard you. Look at. I live in San Diego County. I live in La Mesa, a suburb of San Diego. I'm not near a hazard zone. I'm not near a fire zone. I'm not near anything. I've lived in my house for 25 years. I've never filed a claim on my homeowner's insurance. They dropped me this year, and I had to go find new insurance. It cost me twice as much. So yes, fire zones and insurance are an issue. I think everybody can get insurance, but the cost of insurance goes up. The purchase of a report from Fortress, I don't think that's going to affect insurance rates. That's just what I think. I don't know. I think fire insurance is going to be an issue in California from here on out. Yeah.
Okay, all right, thank you so much, Chuck. I appreciate your time.
Okay, Duncan, thanks for putting this together. Thanks, you guys. Appreciate we've been on here an hour. Really appreciate the time. I hope you learned something. If not, you can drop an email to Duncan. I'll be happy to answer it. Thanks, you guys. I'll see you later. Bye-bye.